because the intersectionality, interesting, it's among many points, but including access. So think about access, right? In terms of when we're talking about people with physical disabilities. Access when we're talking about to reproductive health. Access to the ballot.
Yes, folks. Welcome to Left Reckoning. I'm Matt Leck. Flying solo this week. Our boy David, under the weather after traveling. Wish him well on the socials. Got a fun show, though. GP Jacob, podcaster, multi-talented, I should say. GP Jacob, who, among other things, is a podcaster for the Money.Power.Land.Solidarity show out of Minneapolis, joins us to talk about the rent control efforts in the Twin Cities. Really good conversation we have with him. I have to, immediately have to go off. Just how it is, folks. Otherwise, my cat would have been screaming at my door. So I'm alone today. But I just want to address the Kamala Harris clip up front, because I do think it's important in a media environment where there's a lot of right-wing hate for Kamala Harris that doesn't have any sort of, bearing or call for justice, that there's a real need to people could see my Memphis Grizzlies shorts. For Kamala Harris, the access stuff, God, if I could accomplish one thing, it's wiping that rhetorical tick off the map. Why are we talking about access to ballots? We need to talk about ballots. Or we're talking about access to, I don't know what she's talking about for disabled folks. We need to expand public services and healthcare for folks. Anyways, that clip bothered me. If anybody can find the origin of it, I was unable to sleuth it out myself. It was with some, I believe it was with some young influencers. And that was the instilling of that access talking point right in our very eyes. And it's a problem. But, and we'll see, when Democratic politicians talk about, the ballot, for instance, well, it's good and well for a place like Minneapolis to pass a rent control law if then their Democratic mayor goes and says, we need a working group to take a closer look at this, complete with a whole bunch of real estate folks. But I'm skipping ahead of myself to our GP Jacob interview. First, some good news. In addition to the now 300 union elections votes that have been held for Starbucks employees, there's a new chain that is unionizing. This is, let me share this here. This is Bloomberg's headline. Hundreds of Home Depot workers file petition to unionize in Philadelphia. It's 274 employees to be exact. They're following 60 employees, delivery drivers, Home Depot delivery drivers in San Diego that unionized in 2019. But good for those folks. That's in Philly. We should. I want to just take a drive down the lane of. Well, what I'm trying to say is it couldn't happen to a better person, a better business owner. Ken Langone is a big time piece of crap. The owner, maybe he's still the owner, and he's getting old. Maybe he's just doing TV appearances now, but. One of the founders of Home Depot's name is Ken Langone. He's a guy who you can't avoid his name if you walk through Manhattan. He's put his name on like hospitals and all sorts of crap. The philanthropy guy. But Ken Langone was on back in 2017 when Republicans were talking about making cuts to Medicare, Medicaid. And repealing Obamacare. He was on Fox Business to talk with Neil Cavuto, And just to give you a taste of how plugged into the struggles of everyday people Ken Langone is, here's a sort of a representative clip of, again, he's like a owner of this business, but he mainly seems to do uh, appearances on Fox News and Fox Business.
Pay no attention that they're growing out of whack with the taxpayers' ability to afford them. I'm a nerd, and math upsets me sometimes, so I apologize for those of you who are...
That was just about how we need to cut like Social Security and stuff. And he's a nerd, and that's why he thinks that.
Offended by my
foolish, of course,
exchange with Austin Gazoo, for whom I have great respect. I like him a lot personally, but I don't like a lot what I'm hearing these days on containing the growth in a program, not cutting it, just containing its growth, and that being the equivalent to once again throwing Granny off a cliff. Which brings me to Home Depot co-founder Ken Langone, who became a gazillionaire.
Speaking of throwing Granny off a cliff, here's Ken Langone.
Honoring things like math and the equivalent to once again throwing Granny off a cliff. Which brings me to Home Depot co-founder Ken Langone, who became a gazillionaire, honoring things like math and how to proceed forward. Very good to see you.
Nice seeing you.
What do you make of this argument that the way Democrats have presented the Medicaid so-called cuts, which aren't cuts, just off the growth, and we have a chart here that shows its balance right now, what it was going to be.
What have we learned about growth? If you're not growing along with population, etc., you're making cuts. Very simple.
In the next 10 years versus what it's going to be under this Trump budget plan. It just curtails the growth. But
again, think this is pretty wild, right? So he's talking about Medicaid cuts. Listen to where Ken Langone's brain goes to.
They are calling it heartless cuts and an attack, a cleaver on the middle class. You say what?
I say let's take a program that's grown dramatically in the last 8 years. Food stamps. I don't think people die if they don't smoke. I don't think people die if they don't watch movies. How do we make sure that food stamps are being used for what they're called? Food. And this, to me, is part of the problem.
Well, 44 million get food stamps under much.
So yeah, this doddering old asshole, they're talking about cuts to Medicaid, and he's like, I'll do you one better. How about people stop using this massive thing where people are living just large lifestyles off of food stamps? When's the last time you think Ken Langone has spoken with somebody who uses food stamps? I mean, yeah, what we need to stop is the people buying video games with food stamps. Shut up. And also, Home Depot, very anti-union workplace. I mean, like are many of these sorts of big operations. I'm about to show a video here that went a little bit viral on TikTok. It was described as viral on TikTok by one of the news sites. It got like 11,000 likes. That's close to viral. It's not bad. And it's one of the things about TikTok that kind of makes me feel like, oh, this is why like Steven Crowder hates this, right? Or like why the right hates this is because maybe they haven't yet controlled the don't embarrass the capitalists yet. But this clip of a worker being onboarded to Home Depot a couple of years ago. I just want to play a little bit of their anti-union spiel. And I'll just say, like, when I worked at not Home Depot, Old Navy, very similar, I remember, like, sort of presentation, or I think it was in like a thing I had to click through, like a web portal or something like that. And I'm curious, folks, I'll put up actually the number right now in the post game. I want to hear about your workplaces. Are they anti-union? Have they do you work for one of these chains? Have they done explicit anti-union stuff? Have you had conversations about that? Because this stuff is spreading. But here is this clip of the anti-union propaganda that Home Depot employees have to go through.
Rights of unions to share their opinions. We respect the rights of unions to share their opinions, but we want to provide you with more information so you can consider what a union could mean for you, your family, your coworkers, and the Home Depot. You may be approached with information. You may be asked to sign an authorization card, or someone may request your contact information.
Sorry you had to wait. How can I help you?
Don't worry about it. Chris,
really busy. Is it always like this?
Yeah, we've been working really hard lately.
My job used to be like that until I joined the union. They helped me get a better schedule and more paid time off. If you want, you can go online, fill out your information, and you can get signed up right here.
Oh, no, thank you. I'm really happy working here. And besides, I already have those things here, and our company is really supportive whenever we have concerns.
Apparently, the employees in Philadelphia, and probably I would guess those aren't the only Home Depot employees that aren't able to respond in such a way. Like, actually, we have everything here. There's no understaffing. All the wages. Oh yeah, we love our wage increases. I mean, I almost say too much. You're paying me too much, Home Depot. I mean, are you sure you guys are okay? I mean, maybe take a few more of that. So yeah, I'm just gonna go a little bit back.
You can get signed up right here.
Oh, no, thank you. I'm really happy working here. And besides, I already have those things here, and our company is really supportive whenever we have concerns. Thank you, though.
Okay. Hey, excuse me.
And what this is, I mean, everyone knows, but just to be explicit about it, is less like an information about this is how you're supposed to respond, whether you think that stuff is true, whether you think you got it all here or not. Boss is showing you how to act when this stuff happens, or else we shut stuff down.
This interaction can occur at work, at home, or online. It is now okay for unions to go after your legally binding signature electronically. When you sign, you may be giving up your right to speak for yourself. We believe that
your right to bargain independent of the union, which is at worse leverage, right? It's very interesting, this speech emphasis. In the post game, I'm going to talk a little bit about Glenn Greenwald. Anyway.
Associate can speak for themselves without having to pay their hard-earned money to a union in order to be listened to and have issues resolved. Once you
speak your issues and have them resolved is actually not quite the promise of the union. The thing with the union is, like, I don't think many workers in Starbucks, Home Depot, Chipotle, all sorts of non-national chains are realizing, like, we're not being heard. We have all this great communications technology, but are my messages not getting to boss? If only we could make sure. No, it's about telling the boss what to do, because otherwise you're not getting workers. That's what it's about. It's not about this. People are realizing that your boss, this isn't a family. Nobody, my generation, 33, nobody has experienced that, or very few people have experienced that from a workplace. That feels anything like a family where you are also, like, well compensated.
Sign, the authorization card is legally binding and it's hard to get back. Remember the outdoor garden interaction?
Now, have you ever heard of somebody being, like, really, like, that's been a problem, is these damn union hucksters getting these signatures, and then your life, it's like your identity has been stolen by a union. You never hear of that happening, or people being like, oh, my life is a nightmare since I gave my legally binding signature to somebody who said they could get me better wages. No. What actually sucks is capitalists just decides these interest rates have been too high. The economy's heading into recession. I need to cut these jobs. See ya. Good luck. You're on your own.
She told the associate that a union helped her to get better hours and pay.
Wait. Let's go back here.
Binding, and it's hard to get back. Remember the outdoor garden interaction? She told the associate that a union helped her to get better hours and pay. It's important to know that union representatives often make promises they cannot guarantee. First, unions only make money by taking initiation fees and monthly dues from your paycheck.
Unions are not a profit-seeking enterprise. So this whole, like, this is how they're greedy, actually. Unlike bosses, like, I don't know, is greed really the avenue you want to open up?
And monthly dues from your paycheck. They take this money before you even get to see it. Second, unions cannot guarantee anything. Union promises can only come true if the company agrees to the union's request during bargaining.
Now that's what we call a veiled threat. I don't think any union says we'll do whatever the F we want. I mean, be fun to, be tough talk, but yeah, of course. Like, I think they say, yeah, we are going to give you leverage in this fight that you're having with the person who pays you or doesn't or underpays you. So yeah, that is Home Depot. Solidarity with all the Philadelphia Home Depot workers, 274, extremely inspiring. And yeah, I want to hear from folks. I'll put the number up again for the post game. But what is your experience? I don't remember anything at McDonald's. That was a long time ago for me, or the coffee shop I worked at. But I do remember Old Navy had some anti-union stuff, and I wish I had the wherewithal to video recorded it, like this person does. And yeah, I appreciate people recording this stuff. This is the way we can turn these sort of mass surveillance tools back on the capitalists who are ruining our lives with them. So it's fun to see that stuff go viral on TikTok. Folks, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Got the post game. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how to contextualize somebody like Glenn Greenwald as he appears in a new Tucker Carlson documentary. Because people seem really perplexed, and it's actually quite simple, I think. Maybe go through some, somebody who calls Tucker Carlson a communist. We'll get to that in a little bit too, in the post game as well. Also, we got Left Reckoning merch. Check that out. And the Telegram Ballroom live show in LA. If you're in LA, come see us. It's always see Derek Varn, Ben Burgess. This is Revolution. Jason, actually, I'm not sure if Pascal's. I should double check see if Pascal's going to be there. Anna Kasparian. Danny Bessner. It's gonna be a fun live show in LA. So please come get tickets to that. And without further ado, here's good interview, if I do say so myself. Talk I had with GP Jacob of Money.Power.Land.Solidarity about their rent control attempts in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I hope you guys enjoy this show, and do go subscribe. Money, Power, Land, Solidarity on Patreon if you want. It's also available. I think you can just get it as a podcast for free. And the Instagram I just want to plug for them is at hold on, Grandpa here is having a little bit of a tough time. Oh, at Money, Power, Land, Solidarity. The whole 4 words. We will see. I'll see you on the other side of this interview, folks. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me once again, GP Jacob. Jake is the host of one of my favorite podcasts about one of my favorite cities, a Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast about Minneapolis. He's been on the show once before, but this is his first time on the main show. Jake, thanks so much for joining us once again.
It's my pleasure to be here. Great to talk to you.
So last time you were on, we talked a little bit about these rent control policies that were working their way through the electoral politics of both St. Paul and Minneapolis. Before we get to your new series, Rent Control Radio, give us sort of the background of leading up to this point. How did rent control policy get to the point where we needed a working group?
Certainly. I'll give like an overview. First, I think it's important for people to recognize, and we named it last time I was on the show, but a state law went into effect in 1984 that preempted any municipal government in the state of Minnesota from enacting a rent control policy. So rent control was officially banned at the state level. And Minnesota is one of many states that has this copycat legislation that was moved by the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, the big Koch-funded right-wing group. And that was in response to a popular push for rent control that developed across the country, including in Minneapolis in the late 1970s and 1980s. And so, rent control has a deep history, a long history in this country, a long history internationally. The most recent iterations, the most recent struggles, I should say, really kicked off in the early 2000s. I got involved in the fight for rent control probably in like 2013. And Minneapolis, like a lot of cities across the country, was experiencing increased real estate investment, increased real estate speculation, and rising rents and gentrification, displacement. So the housing justice movement that was percolating in Minneapolis, that was really centered around tenants organizing against slumlords, tenants organizing against evictions. Some of the embers that were still alive from the Occupy Homes movement, people resisting foreclosures, really was bubbling and was very present in the 2017 municipal elections. So the city government that kind of became nationally famous because it was in power when George Floyd was murdered, that city council and Mayor Fry's first term, rent control was an issue that candidates were pushed on and that candidates organized around, made promises around, and I was a part of a coalition that included some socialist groups, that included some local nonprofits, some tenant advocacy groups, some unions, who at that time, our slogan was "Don't move, fight back." We were resisting displacement, and rent control was a key policy goal that we had. And it was kind of slow walked then by the Minneapolis City Council from 2017 up to 2021. So there was promises made, but what happened was they commissioned the University of Minnesota to do a study on rent control, and they kind of slow walked the process, but the people kept fighting. I'm a part of a group called Minneapolis United for Rent Control, and we really gained strength throughout that whole period of 2017 up through 2020. And then in both cities, really impressive grassroots campaigns got it on the ballot. So this preemption law at the state level that bans municipalities from enacting rent control, the only way we could work around that is if we were able to win enough signatures to pass a popular referendum to get it directly on the ballot. So against all odds, you're talking about the summer of 2020 in the Twin Cities when people are dealing with the trauma of real uprising, and COVID on top of that. Both cities were able to successfully organize and get enough petitions so that we were able to put rent control on the ballot for the municipal elections of 2021 in both Minneapolis and in St. Paul. And I really got to salute Housing Equity Now St. Paul as the coalition that really led the fight in St. Paul, and Minneapolis United for Rent Control in Minneapolis. You're talking about, again, through the hardships of COVID, through the uprising, and through a very hostile city administration on both sides of the river, we're able to get it on the ballot. And it had some differences that are important to understand. In St. Paul, the people of St. Paul actually voted on a specific policy. So it laid out what type of rent control would be enacted if this measure passed. And it was one of the most robust and healthy tenant protection. Some people would say strict, rent control policies in the nation. It capped rents at 3%, and it most importantly was universally applied. So it didn't matter how old the building was, how big the building was. When rent control was going to be applied to every single rental unit in the city of St. Paul. And that ballot measure succeeded, and it succeeded on an off cycle in St. Paul. They didn't have a lot of seats up for grabs. So usually this is an election cycle when a lot of working class people and renters probably wouldn't turn out. But because this rent control policy was so popular and because of the great organizing that was done by this coalition, it passed. In Minneapolis, we didn't vote on a specific policy. What went to voters in Minneapolis was, do you give the city council permission to create a rent control policy? So it was a more general approval from voters, right? And it passed, and it passed with flying colors. Minneapolis was a more contested election. There was a lot of publicity around the Minneapolis elections. We talked about it even because, it was the elections after the George Floyd uprising. The mayor was up for election, all the city council seats, and there was a few other ballot measures. And rent control was the most popular ballot measure. It won a wide coalition. These were fiercely popular policies in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. And then we get to the point where these working groups come into effect. So I don't know if that's a good place to pause.
Well, I want to kind of double back. And what was it like bringing this policy of rent control to the people? And like, did they have some familiarity with it? How quick was the enthusiasm from people when you brought it to them?
I mean, my experience is that it was incredibly intuitive for people to be in support of rent control. I door knocked my own building. I lived in South Minneapolis, me and my wife struggling to make the rent like a lot of our neighbors. And, I'd say rent control, and it's kind of self-explanatory. When you hear that, people would perk up and say, do you think there should be a law which prevents the landlord from jacking up your rent? And really, I've got universal support. I've never really had anybody push back on me on it. And the report backs I was getting from organizers in St. Paul is very much the same. This was the landlord lobbies in both cities spent millions of dollars, huge billboards, mailers going out to everybody. And still they could not stop it, because people are really feeling the crunch of rent hikes. I know people in the neighborhood I grew up in. Northeast Minneapolis is a formerly working class area. There's still working class people there, but it was very heavily targeted for new investment and gentrification. And I know people whose whole apartment buildings were pushed out because of rent hikes, people who experienced 200, 300, 400% increases in their rent almost overnight. So in my experience, and my experience as a media maker, interviewing and connecting with other organizers, is that it really makes sense for people. And then, people who aren't really connected to politics, kind of lay people, they say, okay, rent control, a law that prevents the landlord from raising my rent a certain amount, that sounds great. And then when you get into the details with them and say, well, do you think that, because what the debate around rent control gets into, then what type of carve outs and what type of exceptions should be allowed and how heavy should the increase be? And again, I think it's a pretty easy sell for working class people and for renters to say, well, do you think your building should be exempted from this law if it was built within the last 20 years? And if people would say, of course not. It should apply to new construction. Do you think if you move out, should the landlord be able to jack up the rent for the next person then, of what they call that vacancy decontrol? And that doesn't make sense to people either. So really this universal policy, which scandalized so many educated people, in St. Paul, all the housing experts and liberals were saying this is a draconian policy. It's too extreme. It doesn't make sense. But if you're talking to renters, it makes sense that if you're going to pass this type of law, it should apply to every single renter. There shouldn't be carve outs, and there shouldn't. So my experience is that it was, and it was really a good organizing tool. I've seen a lot of people get involved in the campaign. A lot of people follow up. A lot of people express interest. A lot of people will open up to you then when you're knocking on their door talking about, is the landlord raising your rent? Then they also want to talk about unsafe conditions in their apartment. They talk about repairs that aren't getting done and other issues of housing justice. So it's a great catalyst and a great organizing tool, I think.
Yeah. I mean, basically, look, those real estate, like they're trying to fix with PR a failure that's been a long time coming, right? Like capitalists can't provide this housing, really. And now, like, you're going to try to public relations your way out of this mess. Good luck. Like you said, like people understand this instinctually. You have a new sort of project with MPLS, Rent Control Radio, that's following closely this working group. Tell us a little bit about both of those.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll start to say, well, you just laid it out. Rent Control Radio, the city council, when the ballot measure passed last November, the city council right then could have said, okay, bet we're going to write a policy similar to St. Paul's, or they could have chose any policy, and they had permission to pass. They had a mandate really to create a rent control policy and pass it. But what they did instead was, at the behest of real estate developers and landlords, is they said, what we need to do is put together a stakeholder working group, get a bunch of landlords in the room and talk about what type of exemptions and what type of policy we need. And this served two purposes for them. One, it cooled our momentum and it kicked the can down the road, because now this working group has to meet and then their findings have to be digested. And it slows everything down, and then it really takes the power away from renters and puts it back in the hands of landlords and quote unquote experts. And the reason why we want to cover it so closely in Minneapolis is because this just happened. It happened more quickly across the river in St. Paul. So when the St. Paul's victory, that meant that a policy was put in place and it went into effect last spring. So landlords in St. Paul and bankers and developers went into hyperdrive to start to gut the policy. So they did the same thing. They created a 40-person stakeholder group. Even though the voters of St. Paul approved a specific policy, the mayor created this group and they started to whittle away and pick it apart and attack it. And they really gutted the rent control policy. Now, so the city council just voted on amendments that came out of this working group, which instead of a universal policy, now apartments that have been built in the last 20 years are going to be exempted from this rent control policy. And landlords have an opportunity to even extend that farther 20 years back in certain cases. So you went from a universal policy that's going to protect all renters to now a huge slice of renters in Minneapolis or in St. Paul got cut from the policy. And they also instituted a vacancy decontrol, which means that if you're living in a rent controlled building now and you move out, the landlord can now raise the rent. Originally, they wanted to make it a full vacancy decontrol, which meant they could raise it 100, 200%. But they put a cap of, I think, 8%, which is still the difference between eviction and having to move for a lot of people. A lot of working class people can't afford an 8% hike plus inflation. So you're talking about inflation that's 11%. That's a 20% hike on your rent. And this was a tool used by the city government, Democratic-led city government in St. Paul at the behest of developers to walk back the democratic process and to repress the will of St. Paul voters. And now Minneapolis is trying to do the exact same thing with this working group. So Rent Control Radio, we're going to show up to these meetings and we're going to politicize. We're tracking who's on the committee. The committee reveals itself just by looking at its composition. So you have a majority renter city in the city of Minneapolis, right? Over 50% of the people who live in Minneapolis are renters. A big chunk of the rest of those people are mortgage holders, So if you're talking to who's actually landlords and developers, it's a small percentage of the population. And many of those people don't even live in the city. But out of a 24-person working group that they created, there's only 6 renters on the working group. So automatically you're putting a really repressive pro-landlord context. And then it's, you got representatives from billion-dollar developers, you got bankers, you got landlords who hold the varying degrees of holdings. And then you have a lot of professional class, quote unquote, experts, people who work for nonprofit housing developers, people who work for home ownership support centers. And most of these people, except for there's a few tenant activists or advocates who made it onto the working group, but they're severely outnumbered. And if you look at some of these other groups, they've all taken anti-rent control positions or have been completely silent on the issue. So we know that we're going into hostile territory and that this working group is about trying to gut any potential rent control, but we're going to try to politicize. So we're going to bring tenants to the space. We're going to interview some of the members. And the other thing we want to do is, it's a battle of ideas, and we want to contribute socialist ideas to the picture, because you're going to get all sorts of fear mongering about rent control is going to halt housing construction. It's going to stop investment. And we want to be able to step in and say, we need a socialist response to that. We need a robust public housing system. We need a public sector that won't cower to the threats of capital strike by landlords who say they're going to pull out, and we'll step in then and build the housing that we need and invest in the housing that we need. So that's what Rent Control Radio. We just dropped our first episode last week, and we're going to be dropping maybe monthly, maybe more for the foreseeable future to try to intervene in this debate.
Yeah, I really appreciate the detail you all went through with all the different people and how the deck is so clearly stacked against renters, right? It's laughable. And this is like Washington Post has this slogan, democracy dies in the darkness.
Right.
This is every bit an attack on democracy as Donald Trump Republicans do. This is pure industry money coming and overruling the will of the people through technocracy, right? Like, we got to really look really closely with some of our friends who are the exact same people who failed, right? Like, we have to come together and work together and there's no city in this country that I'm aware of. Like, I'm doing probably as well financially as I've done my entire adult life, and I'm still terrified of if I lose this apartment here, I don't know what the fuck I'm gonna do. Rent's gone up so fucking much. So I'm sorry. Sorry about that. My browser just crashed, but it's the real estate industry coming after. But you guys failed, right? Like you failed to provide this housing, and now you get to stack the deck. And I think the desire here among power is to basically say have it be like, oh, it's too complicated. What the voters asked us for is too complicated. And the reality is it's been done before. And actually rent control isn't the most extreme. That's not frankly where we're going, right? Like let's talk
Right.
about the paradox with like we want uncommodified housing that is a right for folks. So this idea that we're going to keep you guys within limits. You can still take profits and still basically be in charge of these units. But Washington D.C. is an example that's done this successfully enough, where you still have the profiteers getting their take, but you get a housing built. And
Right.
I mean, just comment on that for me, if you will.
Yeah, 100%. You cut out there for a second, but I think I was able to stick with you the whole time. And one, just to affirm what you're saying as far as the context of having this room full of wealthy people. The working group meets at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, where most renters can't attend. You have people who are making six-figure salaries, and literally outside of us, it's a lot of unsheltered people. Like the situation is dire and drastic. So just to affirm that, and it's a crisis across the country. People all over, and it's not even just in urban areas. Minneapolis is
Yeah.
not the only part of Minnesota that's struggling. There's renters in the suburbs and there's renters in the rural areas who are also struggling. And yeah, and that's why we want to intervene also, because a rent control policy is a first step. It's a way to stop the immediate displacements. It's a way to give people some semblance of security and to be able to have some stability in their life as renters. But it's not the horizon of housing policy. And this idea of trying to overcomplicate things and pretend like tenants don't know what's best for them, and then also to really try to bully the intellectual space with these kind of liberal, just taken for granted kind of truths that it's about supply and demand. And if we have rent control, nobody will build any more housing. And if we just build enough housing, the price is going to drop. And we want to challenge that. They've been building the neighborhoods that they've built the most housing in Minneapolis is where housing is most unaffordable. We've had a boom of construction, and at the high end of the rental market, they're giving people 3 months free rent to try to coax people to come live here. So we have to complicate these like bullshit Econ 101 platitudes that people throw out to try to disarm us, and really say, no, we want a socialist housing ecosystem. We know that housing is a human right. We know that we can produce beautiful, attractive, well-maintained housing for every member of our society. And it's not easy, but it's doable. And we can't allow them to just poo-poo us with these bullshit, this fear-mongering of nobody's going to build anything. And they it's an argument over the track record of rent control. They'll say rent control failed. We'll say the only apartments that people can still live in New York and San Francisco and these big cities are rent controlled apartments. It's been very successful. And that's why Alec had to step in and create a rent control preemption bill, And the other thing I wanted to touch on, two things that I think folks in other contexts who are organizing might relate with, or I'd like to connect with people around, is one is the role of the city government and the role of consultants in this process, right? Because when the voters approved the rent control ballot measure and then this working group was created, it brought back to mind a great book I read called Capital City by Samuel Stein, Gentrification in the Real Estate State. He points to a concept, I think, that was developed by Richard Fogelsong, who's kind of a Marxist planner. And he talked about the capitalist democracy contradiction, and that this is really the function of this class that works as planners in urban governments and this class that works as contractors. And what it is saying, like, nominally we live in a democracy and there has to be at least the facade of public participation, or we have at least the power to force a ballot referendum, right? So there is an element of democracy at play, but that's in contradiction with the reality of capitalism, that those who hold property, the elite property owning minority class, really controls the levers of the state. So the role of these consultants and the role of these city planners is to manage that contradiction. And that's what this working group is all about. So they hired a firm that's local, that's getting a check to facilitate these meetings. And really the whole purpose is to obscure this contradiction. So what I heard listening into the discussions of the members of the working group was a lot of landlords saying, we're all on the same side. We all want the same thing. We all see there's a problem. We just might have different means of coming to a solution. And that's what we're trying to push against and really press the contradictions. You profit off of our housing. You've been raking in, you're literally sitting at this table representing $1 billion corporation. We're not on the same side. And we have different interests in this process, and push that contradiction. I might have got away from your prompt.
No, that I wanted to go exactly where you went. Like that I think spelling that out to people is important, because you do get all the flim-flammery about supply and demand. But here's the real thing to understand is that those motherfuckers are not looking for their assets, which is housing, to go down in price. They have every incentive to make sure that goes up in price. Okay, the government could very easily build housing that is better quality than what I'm in right now. But you know what would happen is you'd get all these landlords saying, you've just wiped out my investment. I am
100.
underwater now. It is a conspiracy against housing people generally. And it sucks, because there's like a bunch of, it's almost like trying to get everybody's hands bloody with it, where we tried to extend housing as like a middle class, sort of a promise of middle class, where you have people's entire lives and retirements in this asset that everyone needs to help keep rising in price, that owns it. And that's a contradiction that we just are going to need to address. And it's not going to be addressed just by more, supply, by letting the suppliers, have lower taxes or whatever.
100%. You're absolutely right. And it's that contradiction between the use value of housing, that somebody needs a place to live and be home with their family, and the speculative nature of it, people who are trying to profit off it. And that's also why we wanted to make an intervention with Rent Control Radio, because you get a lot of liberals then who are nominally in support of rent control, but they'll be the first ones who want to create these carve outs and who want to create these exemptions. You've seen a lot of people who even nominally will consider themselves on the left, who were really up in arms about St. Paul's rent control policy, because they want all these carve outs, and they can't take the step of saying, they want to say, assure the bankers and assure the landlords, you'll still be able to make a profit. We just want to work around the edges. And it's true that you could enact a rent control policy and provide some more stability for renters and still allow for people could still build housing in a profitable manner. And that's true, but we don't want to stop there. And we don't want to start backbiting and undercutting ourselves by automatically making concessions. We want to push towards the horizon and say, rent control is not enough. We need rent control. We need to start building public housing again. We need to start I'm looking at laws internationally where, the tenants movement is starting to take buildings off of the private market. That's where we need to go. We have all the housing we need in Minneapolis right now. There's tons of buildings that are sitting under occupied. The building that I lived in, that I just moved out of, on my floor alone, we had 3 or 4 Airbnbs. And as we were living there, we saw more and more of these short-term rentals. And we're in a working class area where people desperately need housing. So we need political leadership that's going to be aggressive in that way and start pushing the horizon, because that's what resonates with renters. And once you go knock on somebody's door and you talk to them about rent control and get them fired up, the last thing you want to do is start putting water on that flame, and telling them that you can't ask for more, or the only way forward is to really push towards that socialist horizon. That's what gets people motivated, and that's where we have to take it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what do I want to say about that? Like, basically we need the state to get involved and start making this stuff. And if we have stakeholders in the real estate industry, well, I'm not gonna be able to build housing. Well, it's like, well, we're gonna do it without you then. Right? That's where we have to go.
Good riddance, motherfucker. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's the answer. We have to get to a point where we can be strong enough to say that. And one term like we're really trying to use locally is when they say, oh, we can't build housing, It's not a can't. That's a political choice. That's a capital strike. That's capital saying we're not going to bring our ball to the table, and we have to build the strength to counter that. And exactly what really that should be there's only so much land in the city, and from an aggressive standpoint, we want rent control to cool the market. We want some of those private investors to back out, but we have to have the public sector there to step in and fill that gap. It's a
Yep.
competition for the land that's here. And really what it's come down to, I think what I've learned and kind of matured politically, and I think a lot of us in the Twin Cities are getting to that point where came into the fight thinking, okay, rent control, that's great, but from a liberal perspective, and thinking that rent control could fit inside of the neoliberal housing ecosystem where you have here, where the public sector is completely absent from the working group. The public sector is largely absent from the conversation here. And that's a real weakness that we have to take stock of. Both the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority has been, kind of dominated by these state actors, right? People who have intentionally been trying to undermine it and privatize it. And we need to go to battle against them. And we need to rebuild that capacity, and a lot of it, there's the strength, the movement that I come out of here really that has a lot of strength is the direct action movement. We were occupying homes when banks were trying to foreclose them and physically stopping people from being evicted. During the uprising, we commandeered a hotel. We just moved in and said, we're housing people here. And it's like, really, I think the explosive dynamic is when these two mind frames can intersect. The direct action tenant movement that's seizing control of buildings. There's such an inspiring, I would encourage people to look up the Sky Without Limits Cooperative, which was a group of tenants in South Minneapolis who organized against a notorious slumlord here. They won a class action lawsuit. They kept pushing, and they ended up buying the buildings from him, and now they run them as a cooperative. So that's also not a solution that can take the place of public housing, but it's one avenue towards taking units off of the private market, putting them into public and cooperative ownership, and it's one of the models. There's also, I got to shout out the Defend Glendale movement, Defend Glendale and Public Housing Coalition, which is a group of public housing residents in the Glendale townhomes, which is one of the older public housing developments in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis. Through their own research, they discovered that the MPHA, the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, and the city of Minneapolis had plans to destroy their homes and move them out and rebuild these mixed income. They're in a very high value part of town now that's right by the University of Minnesota. And they've just put up a valiant fight. They've preserved their homes, and they're doing a lot of the politicizing around public housing. So I got to big them up and encourage people to look into that, because they're really also the ones who are leading the way.
Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to touch on, you hear a lot, and I think we're in 2022, we're a bit ways away from a lot of the stereotypes of public housing as, run down and this and that. Like that's a policy choice, right? We need to point out to people that that when the state historically gets to the point of providing public housing that is really appealing and people want to live in, then all of a sudden judges come in and say, this is confiscatory, or this is, a taking, or this is like some other bullshit that is just saying you're being unfair to the capitalists,
right,
and hurting their spiel. So that, I hope you haven't run into too much of that. My sense is, given how popular it is, our generation just doesn't have that sort of Reagan era disdain for the public provided goods.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. And we have a lot of public housing, even though it's under attack. And we've had one of the most aggressive, actually the person who's now in charge of NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, Greg Russ, he came to New York from Minneapolis on a privatizing mission. So I know that the struggle is kicked up in New York because he went there for the purpose of privatizing as much New York City public housing as possible. And he did the same thing here. But we still have Little Earth, which is, I think, the only Native American specific public housing development in the urban area. We have the Cedar Riverside neighborhood is full of public housing. And you hear all the time, like you said, the fear mongering and attacks, and you'd think public housing was just nothing but infestation. And while there's deliberately been a tax on it and underfunding and mismanagement, there's still so much beauty and so many homes provided and so much community in public housing, and we need to reclaim that. Yeah, and I don't think our generation has been poisoned in the same way. We do run into those attacks, but they don't carry the same purchase. I don't think as public housing was like a dirty word when we were growing up. You only thought about a lot of the racist stereotypes that are thrown out, and it's definitely still a part of the battle. Though I think young people, we've grown up in such a neoliberal era that a lot of people don't even know about public housing, don't even know that it's possible, so there's a lot of cool politicizing happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like those sort, when you could get a mortgage from like a part-time job 50 years ago, like, yeah, I guess
Right.
but so a broader question. I think you're really good at this, Jake, in sort of following, especially municipal politics, at a close, detailed level, without being sort of naive about the promise of what municipal politics could deliver. So I'm just curious if you could just talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of people think like, oh, you're paying attention to this stuff, it's you're selling out, but also I think like you have the vice versa of people thinking like, okay, we need to follow this sort of like technocratic process, and that will lead us to the promised land.
You really just nailed it. I'm always checking in with myself and reflecting on, is this a valuable use of my time? Is this politically fruitful, to follow these processes? But one thing I'll say is that like I ended up in these rooms from the streets, from actual struggle and actual organizing. There was the piece of Land Over North that jumped off our podcast, and it was from real people in real time challenging the sale of this public land. And we then went into the rooms to challenge. We didn't go into the rooms expecting that the city was going to treat us with respect and honesty and meet our needs. But we also knew that that's where our struggle brought us. So we had to go in there and challenge, and it's I think really important to maintain a dynamic look at it. Like you said, it is realizing that from a political consciousness raising perspective and political education is really walking with people in real time into these rooms so we can see like, okay, we learned that we live in a democracy, but I just voted and now I go into this room and they got 28 landlords in here telling me why I can't do it, and the city council's following them. That's a moment of political clarity for people to turn towards a more communist perspective, to say like, okay, we need fundamental changes in the way we do things, in our property relationships and in our political processes. So it's really, if I'm walking into these rooms with comrades and with people that I'm organizing with, is preparing ourselves for that and not naively walking people into defeat. Because I have seen people do that. That's what nonprofits do. Is nonprofits are invested in these processes a lot of times, and it's their job to kind of help manage these contradictions, and they want to bring in working class people in an ornamental way. The working class people come in really fired up about an issue. They go into these types of committees or this legislative process. They see that it's bullshit and they get burnt out, and they serve their purpose, and the nonprofit can put them on the brochure and wipe their hands with them. And then you have somebody who's politically really disheartened and turned off. But that's not the way that it has to be, because if we go into these rooms and we challenge and we keep going back and doing organizing outside of these spaces, that's where I think that could be useful, and it's also though I'm always checking, like, am I spending too much time going to these meetings? Am I getting lost in the sauce? And it's just a matter of, I think, trying to stay balanced and trying to stay grounded, and then also trying to stay politically creative. Because I'm thinking like what we know and we said in our Rent Control Radio episode is this is really an exercise in political education. It's not a place where we have political strength. We're not really going in here expecting to walk away with a victory. So what else do we need to do? We need to go back to tenants. We need to be in the buildings. We need to be door knocking. We need to be running campaigns that are challenging individual landlords. And we need to have that back and forth process, where we're breaking down what's being said in these rooms and challenging and doing the political education. So I appreciate the shout out, man. It can be like heartbreaking and taxing. So for me, it's like a process of also trying to not put myself on a path where I'm just perpetually going into these rooms and being frustrated and taking losses, but going into the rooms with strategy, going into the rooms with a clear mechanism of reporting back. And I think it's like the same way we should engage electoral politics, because it's recognizing that these are not where our solutions lie. We can't be opportunists. And especially, like, I could get a job out of this if I really, really wanted to. You know what I'm saying? I know how to go in there and talk their shit, but it's like we have to resist that, and we have to blow up these spaces when it's appropriate. And we have to use these spaces to push the radical edge and not get lost in them. So it's a balance, it's definitely a balance. And it's something that I'm always like trying to refine my approach, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I think our audience certainly. I mean, we get a question like a week of how do you not, get black pilled on nihilism, and it's like,
Right.
well, lower your expectations.
Hey, I swear. Hey, also though, I was really intrigued by. I was listening to a conversation you all were having with the This Is Revolution folks, and talking about the water crisis in Jackson and the dynamic between local power and federal power. So, in the rent control fight, we're talking about the municipal government on both sides of the river. We're talking about county government, we're talking about the state government, and then we're talking about federal government. And one thing that I got lost in the municipal sauce when I was younger. I got very involved in local campaigns, and there was almost a fetishizing of local activism, because what I realized is that was the nonprofit sector and the foundation economy in Minneapolis really depoliticizing people by kind of sending us on these wild goose chases on these local task forces, and it goes nowhere. And it's really important to challenge that and to say, like, we need a national tenants movement. We need federal power. One thing about the Bernie Sanders campaign that I think is worthwhile as a policy platform was they were calling for a national rent control policy that lifted us up in Minneapolis. And so while we have to have these national struggles, we also have to act where we are. I think it's just the struggle of trying to be a socialist in the United States is we have to start where we are, and we also have to make these connections. So I even think, meeting you and meeting David is cool. And we studied the Jackson Kush plan, the organizing that happened in Jackson, Mississippi. We went down to Mississippi in 2014, a group of folks from Minneapolis, to learn from the current mayor's father. He died actually right before a conference they hosted in 2014. And it's been a source of constant reflection and learning, because it's like, yeah, how do you balance the local, the regional, and the national? I don't have a clear answer, but I know, like, we have to get busy where we are, and we have to
Yep.
try to expand and make connections.
Exactly. Well, I mean, we've came from the super local to the national. Is there anything you want to comment on politics globally before we let you out here, Jake?
Yeah, man, I gotta say, like, my heart and my mind is like, it's unacceptable, the warmongering, just the imperialism that our government in our name is doing. Like the provocations against Taiwan, the warmongering in Ukraine, that the Democratic Party is taking this reckless approach. And of course, it's no surprise that's what the United States is. It's a global empire. But I just feel like it's really been making me feel insane and crazy that it just, I hear these reports on the mainstream media talking about, the provocations in Taiwan and the warmongering. And I don't know, man, it's just like, I feel like I want to talk about it out loud with more people. I try to bring it up in my daily life, and just how do we start to chip away at that? So I did want to say that, just because we're here talking in the United States, and it's so wrong what our country is doing. It's so hostile. And I feel like as communists and socialists, it's like, this government does not represent me, and we have to find ways to challenge from the inside, because this shit is just is disgusting.
Yeah. I'll just say, and we've taken people are pretty pissed about our Ukraine coverage, and I'll just say, like, and even though I don't think we've taken it fairly, we've played it fairly down the middle, I think, here on Left Reckoning. But I also want to say, recently I pissed somebody out because I said there was reports that the West offered Russia, before the invasion of Ukraine, um, assurances that Ukraine would not be added to NATO. And I simply said, if that was offered, good to offer that, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's what they should have offered. And people just get mad. And it's like, first of all, I guess you're mad at the fucking negotiators there too. That, like, are those folks, anti-American or whatever? Like, I agree. Like there needs to be a lot more room for questions on this sort of stuff, particularly at a time where Congress is lockstep with sending more money at any point to Ukraine.
100%. Come on, man. The history of NATO and just the global empire has to be confronted. It definitely has to be confronted, and it's disgusting. It's terrible. We play a terrible role in the world, and the shit's got to stop.
Absolutely. Well, Jake, where can people follow all your stuff?
Yes, you can follow the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast on Instagram. It's just those 4 words, Money, Power, Land, Solidarity. You can follow me at g.p.jacob. We're on Patreon, patreon.com/Money, Power, Land, Solidarity. We got a large back catalog if you want to get caught up on local issues. Right now we're doing Rent Control Radio, and we're also exploring some cool ideas for kind of our next rollout. So really appreciate the invite, Matt. It's really good to talk to you.
Yeah, good to talk to you too, Jake. I'm gonna get some of that merch one of these days too.
Oh hell yeah. We got some new beanies coming out too. What I'm trying to do is they just legalized low dose edibles in Minnesota, so we're trying to work on a little THC seltzer collaboration. So hopefully we'll get to toast one sometime.
Wow, that sounds awesome.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Thanks so much, Jake.
Yeah, peace, bro.
Oops. Yeah, Jake is great. Follow Money.Power.Land.Solidarity. And I realize you mentioned Taiwan there. Bronco Marshut's got an article. The U.S.'s Taiwan policy could provoke another dumb and dangerous war. I had made the point about Ukraine a little bit. But folks, speaking of foreign policy, do follow Money, Power, Land, Solidarity. I want to see a show like every city deserves a show of that quality, and it's I'm really impressed by Jake's perspective and the work that he puts in with fighting for things like that. Let's talk really briefly before we go to the post game about England. Just really briefly, really cursory glance. I'm not going to do an accent. We need to get one of our either maybe Ronan Burtonshaw, Paul O'Connell on figure out what's been going on. A lot of stuff's been going on. But there's 2 videos, really brief videos that I wanted to play before we head over to the post game. The first is one just related to the Queen. They've been taking a lot of L's. The UK has in terms of its culture. It's no longer like Spice Girls and people thinking Tony Blair is cool and the Beatles and stuff. I used to be a big Anglophile. Steve Coogan, British comedy all the way back to like Peter Cook, Ricky Gervais, loved it. But recently been crowded out by the transphobia. I mean, speaking of British comedy, Graham Linehan went crazy, apparently. J.K. Rowling, of course. But every once in a while, they come through with just a golden nugget, sort of, Pink Floyd. And this piece of culture from TikTok, Sully's Privo, says Dundalk does it best. Wait, is Dundalk, where's Dundalk? It says, I'm not sure where Dundalk is. It sounds Australian to me. I don't know why. But anyway, this chant has been in my head all week. And, it makes me think of like those, when you, in history books, you read like, oh, this was a British a drinking song in London in like 1485. And it's like, okay, I can almost imagine that being sung today. And this has that sort of like timelessness feel to it, while being topical, basically reporting of the news.
Laying on the carpet, who's that laying on the floor? It's Lizzie on her back and she's had a heart attack and she won't be ruling England anymore.
And I think there's something about the accent that makes it seem a little bit timeless too. But who's that laying on the carpet? Who's that laying on the floor? It's Lizzie on her back. She's had a heart attack and she won't be ruling England anymore. The first time I heard it, it was memorized. Absolutely like in there. And I wanted to sing it. And like I said, it sounds like something you could imagine, like, you know, at sort of a pub off the docks, but from like 500 years ago or whatever. But I love like the inclusion of carpet. It's just a nice touch. I mean, I don't want to get too morbid here, but it's very good job with that. And then another. Speaking of Australia, this is Australia 9 News. Um, Australian media reporting of the funeral, and this is why we need to get one of our British, UK, England, depending on how specific we're getting, guests on, because I don't know who Liz Truss is really either. Like I've seen very few things cursorily, but I haven't really dug into it. And this clip was very funny to me because I as somebody who like has to write up or had to, now it's Bradley's job, but on Majority Report, the sound sheet naming every fucking idiot on, say, a Fox Business panel or Fox News panel, like out of their like, array of, alcoholic 50-year-old white dudes and blonde women. Um, this is relatable, actually.
Who's this?
No, hard to identify. Maybe minor royals, members of the... I can't identify them at this point.
We can't spot everyone,
no.
Unfortunately. They look like they could well be local dignitaries. It's hard to see. We're looking at the backs of their heads mostly.
But I think we are now getting to the pointy end, as they say, of the... I'm just told that was Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister, in the distance that we could see hopping out of that car. Well, thank you very much.
Who's this?
I love that. I love probably a minor royal or something. We're getting to the pointy end. So yeah, people haven't quite caught up to Liz Truss. I haven't. I certainly haven't. I'm sorry, guys. There was a time where I was following UK politics very closely, like the Gordon Brown era, and then I don't know, like if I'm honest, Corbyn lost, and it's like, okay, I'm out of here. Wake me up when Corbyn's back in charge. I don't know what's going on here, but anyway, folks, Patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Can talk about this new Tucker Carlson, Glenn Greenwald assisted expose of the Chinese influence, insidious Chinese in Brazil, and the fighter Bolsonaro. So patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Join me. Oh, and if you have voicemails, 1-940-289-7234. You can leave a message, talk about, did you have to get subjected to an anti-union spiel like that home improvement one? Do you talk to your coworkers about unionizing? It's very strange. Like I often... Yeah, we'll talk about it in the post game. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning, folks. Thanks so much for joining me tonight.